In the annals of biblical history, few figures command as much respect and admiration as Deborah, the remarkable woman who rose to become both judge and prophetess in ancient Israel. Her story unfolds during one of the darkest periods in Hebrew history, when the Israelites had once again fallen into cycles of disobedience, oppression, and desperate cries for deliverance. Yet from this darkness emerged a light so brilliant that it would illuminate the path to freedom for an entire nation. The time was approximately 1200 BCE, during the tumultuous period of the Judges, when Israel had no king and every man did what was right in his own eyes. The promised land that had been given to Abraham's descendants was constantly under threat from surrounding nations, and the Israelites found themselves caught in a repeating pattern of rebellion against God, followed by subjugation to foreign powers, then repentance and divine rescue through appointed judges. For 20 long years, the children of Israel had groaned under the oppressive rule of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned from the fortress city of Hazor. His military commander, Sisera, was a name that struck terror into the hearts of Hebrew families across the northern territories. With 900 chariots of iron at his disposal, Sisera had created what seemed like an impenetrable war machine that dominated the region with ruthless efficiency. The iron chariots were a technological marvel of their time, representing the cutting edge of ancient warfare. While the Israelites fought primarily on foot with bronze weapons, these massive war machines thundered across the battlefield, pulled by powerful horses, their iron-reinforced wheels crushing everything in their path. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction they wrought. The sound alone of 900 chariots advancing in formation was enough to send entire armies fleeing in terror. Under this crushing oppression, the Israelites had been reduced to a shadow of their former glory. Trade routes were controlled by Canaanite forces, making commerce nearly impossible. Hebrew merchants who once traveled freely throughout the region now found their paths blocked by hostile checkpoints and extortionate taxation. The very roads that had once connected Israelite communities became dangerous passages where Canaanite soldiers extracted tribute from anyone daring to travel. Agriculture, the lifeblood of ancient Israel, suffered tremendously under Sisera's iron grip. Hebrew farmers were forced to surrender a portion of their harvest to Canaanite tax collectors, leaving many families on the brink of starvation. The timing of these collections was particularly cruel, often occurring just before the winter months, when food stores were most critical for survival. Young men were conscripted into forced labor projects, building fortifications that would only strengthen their oppressors' hold over the land. In the midst of this national crisis, God's eyes fell upon an unlikely deliverer. Deborah was not a warrior trained in the arts of combat, nor was she from a prominent military family. She was a wife, known as the wife of Lapidoth, whose name means torches or flames. Some scholars suggest this may have indicated her husband's profession as a torchmaker, while others propose it was a prophetic reference to the fire of God's Spirit that would burn brightly through his wife's ministry. What set Deborah apart was not her social status or political connections, but her intimate relationship with the Almighty. In an age when communication with God was rare and precious, Deborah had cultivated such a pure heart and listening ear that the Lord chose her as his mouthpiece to the nation. The biblical text tells us that she was a prophetess, one through whom God spoke his will to his people. This was an extraordinary calling in any era, but particularly remarkable in ancient times when women's voices were often marginalized in matters of national importance. Deborah held court under a palm tree that became known throughout the region as the Palm of Deborah. This tree, located between the cities of Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, became a symbol of justice and divine wisdom. Unlike the enclosed judgment halls of kings and princes, Deborah's court was open to all who sought truth and righteousness. The palm tree itself was significant in Hebrew culture, representing victory, honor, and flourishing life even in difficult circumstances. Day after day, people from across the tribes of Israel made pilgrimages to seek Deborah's counsel. They came with disputes over property, conflicts between neighbors, questions about religious law, and matters of tribal governance. Her reputation for fairness and wisdom spread like wildfire throughout the land. What made her judgment so respected was not merely her keen intellect, but the evident presence of God's Spirit in her decisions. Those who appeared before her left, knowing they had heard not just human wisdom, but divine truth. The biblical account tells us that she judged Israel during this period, indicating that her influence extended far beyond settling local disputes. As a judge in the biblical sense, Deborah served as both a civil leader and spiritual guide, helping to govern the nation according to God's laws and purposes. This was a tremendous responsibility, particularly during such turbulent times when the very survival of Israel hung in the balance. But Deborah's role extended beyond that of judge to encompass the sacred calling of prophetess. Through her, God revealed his plans for the liberation of his people from Canaanite oppression. It was in this capacity that she received one of the most dramatic and consequential divine revelations in the book of Judges. The Lord spoke to her concerning a man named Barak, son of Abinoam, from the tribe of Naphtali. Barak was a military leader with a reputation for courage and tactical skill, but like many Israelites of his generation, he had grown discouraged by the seemingly impossible odds they faced against Sisera's superior forces. The repeated defeats at the hands of the Canaanites had taken a toll on Hebrew morale, and many had begun to wonder whether God had abandoned his chosen people entirely. When Deborah summoned Barak to appear before her at the palm tree, he likely expected to receive counsel about some military matter, or perhaps guidance regarding his responsibilities as a tribal leader. What he received instead was a direct commission from the God of Israel that would change the course of history. Speaking with the authority of divine revelation, Deborah delivered to Barak a message that must have seemed both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. The Lord commanded Barak to gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them to Mount Tabor, a prominent hill in the northern region of Israel. This mountain, rising over Ains, 800 feet above the surrounding valleys, would serve as the staging ground for what seemed like a suicidal military operation. From this elevated position, Barak was to challenge the mighty Sisera and his 900 iron chariots to battle. The strategic brilliance of this divine plan would not have been immediately apparent to human military thinking. Mount Tabor, while providing an excellent defensive position, was also somewhat isolated from major population centers that could provide reinforcements or supplies. Moreover, the very idea of deliberately provoking Sisera into battle seemed like madness to many who understood the devastating power of his chariot forces. Yet Deborah's message included a promise that transformed this apparent suicide mission into a guaranteed victory. The Lord himself would draw Sisera and his army to the river Kishon, which flowed through the valley below Mount Tabor. At this predetermined location, God would deliver the Canaanite forces into Barak's hands, along with their feared chariots and vast army. The Kishon River was well known to both armies as a seasonal waterway that could transform from a modest stream into a raging torrent depending on weather conditions. During dry seasons, it presented little obstacle to military movement, but winter rains and sudden storms could quickly turn it into an impassable barrier. The significance of this geographical detail would become crucial to understanding how God intended to accomplish this miraculous deliverance. Barak's response to this divine commission reveals both his faith and his human limitations. While he accepted the truth of Deborah's prophetic word, he insisted on one condition that would add an unexpected dimension to the upcoming battle. He declared that he would only proceed with this mission if Deborah herself accompanied him and his forces. This was not merely a request for moral support, but a recognition of the spiritual authority and divine favor that rested upon this remarkable woman. Deborah agreed to accompany Barak, but her acceptance came with a prophetic warning that would challenge conventional expectations about military glory and honor. She revealed that because Barak had requested her presence, rather than proceeding in simple obedience to God's command, the ultimate honor for defeating Sisera would not rest with him. Instead, the Lord would deliver the enemy commander into the hand of a woman. This prophecy introduced an element of divine irony that would demonstrate God's ability to confound human pride and expectations. In ancient Near Eastern culture, military victory was typically seen as the ultimate expression of masculine honor and strength. For a renowned warrior like Sisera to be defeated by a woman would represent not just a military loss, but a profound humiliation that would echo throughout the region. The assembly of Israel's army began as word spread throughout the territories of Naphtali and Zebulun. Men left their farms, their trades, and their families to answer the call to battle against their oppressors. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen who had endured 20 years of subjugation and were ready to risk everything for the chance of freedom. Many had fathers or brothers who had fallen in previous conflicts with the Canaanites, making this not just a military campaign, but a deeply personal quest for justice and redemption. As the Hebrew forces gathered at Mount Tabor, their numbers grew to the 10,000 that God had specified through Deborah's prophecy. This was a significant force by the standards of the time, but still seemingly inadequate when compared to Sisera's professional army and devastating chariot corps. Yet what these Israelite warriors lacked in military technology, they possessed in divine promise and righteous purpose. The presence of Deborah among the troops had an electrifying effect on morale. Here was living proof that God had not abandoned his people, that he still spoke through chosen vessels and intended to fulfill his covenant promises. Her very presence served as a constant reminder that this battle was not merely a human conflict, but a divine intervention in the affairs of nations. Meanwhile, reports of the Israelite gathering reached Sisera in his headquarters, likely located in the fortified city of Harosheth Hagoyim. The idea that the defeated Hebrews were openly assembling for battle must have seemed almost comical to the Canaanite general. After 20 years of dominance, during which no Israelite force had dared challenge his authority directly, this apparent rebellion would have been viewed as an opportunity to crush Hebrew resistance once and for all. Sisera's decision to respond with overwhelming force played directly into God's strategic plan. Rather than sending a small contingent to disperse what might have been dismissed as a minor uprising, he chose to mobilize his entire army. All 900 iron chariots were prepared for battle, their crews confident in their proven ability to dominate any battlefield. Professional infantry units were assembled and equipped with the finest weapons available to ancient armies. The mobilization of such a massive force for what appeared to be a relatively minor threat reveals something of Sisera's character and military philosophy. He was not content merely to achieve tactical victories, but sought to establish such overwhelming superiority that future resistance would become unthinkable. This campaign against Barak's forces would serve as an object lesson to any other Hebrew communities that might harbor thoughts of rebellion. As Sisera's army advanced toward the valley of the Kishon River, the thunder of 900 chariots must have been audible for miles in every direction. The earth itself trembled under the weight of this military juggernaut, and the psychological impact on any observers would have been tremendous. From the perspective of human military analysis, the Israelites were about to face an absolutely hopeless situation. But Deborah understood that this battle would not be decided by conventional military factors. As she and Barak observed Sisera's approaching forces from their elevated position on Mount Tabor, she delivered another prophetic word that would signal the beginning of God's miraculous intervention. With absolute confidence in the divine promise she had received, Deborah declared that this was the day the Lord would deliver Sisera into their hands, and that God himself would go before them in battle. The Hebrew forces descended from Mount Tabor, with their prophetess and judge at their side, a sight that must have seemed surreal to any Canaanite observers. Here was an army led partly by a woman, charging down from their mountain stronghold to face the most feared military force in the region. By every conventional measure of military wisdom, this was an act of collective suicide. What happened next can only be described as divine intervention on a scale rarely witnessed in human history. As the two armies converged near the Kishon River, the God of Israel demonstrated his absolute sovereignty over the forces of nature and the affairs of men. The biblical account tells us that the Lord threw Sisera's army into confusion, and that all his chariots and forces were defeated by the edge of the sword. The nature of this divine intervention becomes clearer when we consider the geographical and meteorological conditions that God orchestrated for this moment. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that the Lord sent a sudden and violent rainstorm that transformed the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. The same Kishon River that had been designated as the site of Sisera's defeat became the instrument of his army's destruction. The iron chariots that had been Sisera's greatest advantage became his ultimate liability as the ground beneath them turned to impassable mud. These massive war machines, so terrifying on firm ground, became death traps for their crews as they sank into the softened earth. Horses struggled frantically to maintain footing on surfaces that had become as slippery as ice, while chariot wheels became hopelessly mired in the accumulated mud and debris. The sudden transformation of weather conditions created chaos throughout the Canaanite ranks. Professional soldiers, who had trained for combat on solid ground, found themselves struggling simply to move across a battlefield that had become an obstacle course of mud, flooding, and debris. The carefully orchestrated formations that made Sisera's army so effective dissolved into confused clusters of men fighting desperately just to survive the elements. Barak's forces, fighting on foot and familiar with the challenging terrain of their homeland, maintained their effectiveness even under these difficult conditions. The same storm that neutralized Sisera's technological advantages actually worked to the Hebrews' benefit, as their lighter equipment and infantry tactics proved more adaptable to the changed circumstances. The biblical account emphasizes that not a single man of Sisera's army survived the battle, except for Sisera himself, who abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. This complete annihilation of such a powerful force could only be explained as direct divine intervention. The God of Israel had demonstrated once again his ability to humble the proud and deliver his people through means that confounded human wisdom and expectations. As Sisera fled from the scene of his devastating defeat, his destination was the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. The Kenites were a nomadic people who had maintained neutral relationships with various groups in the region, and Heber's clan had established peaceful relations with Jabin, king of Canaan. This diplomatic immunity made Jael's tent seem like a logical place of refuge for the fleeing general. Jael's actions in the moments that followed would fulfill Deborah's earlier prophecy about the Lord delivering Sisera into the hand of a woman. When the exhausted and desperate commander arrived at her tent seeking sanctuary, Jael welcomed him with apparent hospitality. She invited him to enter, covered him with a blanket, and even provided him with milk when he requested water. Sisera, believing himself safe under the traditional laws of hospitality that governed Bedouin culture, allowed himself to relax and even fall asleep. He instructed Jael to stand guard at the tent entrance and to deny his presence if anyone came searching for him. Exhausted by his flight and trusting in the protection of tribal custom, the once mighty commander of Canaan's armies lay down to rest. But Jael had made a decision that would echo through biblical history and demonstrate the mysterious ways in which God accomplishes his purposes. Taking a tent peg and hammer, the tools of her nomadic lifestyle, she approached the sleeping Sisera and drove the peg through his temple, pinning him to the ground. The man who had terrorized Israel for 20 years died not in glorious battle, but in ignominious defeat at the hands of a woman using household implements. When Barak arrived in pursuit of his fleeing enemy, Jael emerged from her tent to show him the fulfillment of divine justice. Sisera, the seemingly invincible commander whose very name had struck fear throughout the land, lay dead by the hand of a woman, exactly as Deborah had prophesied. The irony was complete. The man who had relied on iron chariots and overwhelming force had been defeated by a simple tent peg in the hands of a nomadic woman. The news of Sisera's death and the complete destruction of his army spread rapidly throughout the region, sending shockwaves through Canaanite territories and inspiring hope among Israelite communities. The psychological impact of this victory was as significant as the military one. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Canaanite forces for 2 decades had been shattered in a single day. King Jabin, upon learning of the catastrophic defeat of his military commander and army, found his position suddenly precarious. The vassal cities that had submitted to Canaanite rule began to reconsider their allegiances, while Hebrew communities that had lived in fear started to organize resistance movements. The entire power structure that had dominated northern Israel for 20 years began to crumble. The victory at the Kishon River became the catalyst for a broader campaign that ultimately led to the complete overthrow of Jabin's oppressive regime. The biblical text tells us that the children of Israel continued to press their advantage until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. This was not merely a single battle victory, but the beginning of a liberation movement that restored Israelite independence throughout the northern territories. In the aftermath of this tremendous victory, Deborah and Barak composed one of the most beautiful and stirring pieces of Hebrew poetry found in the Old Testament. Known as the Song of Deborah, this victory hymn celebrates not only the military triumph, but also the theological significance of God's intervention on behalf of his people. The song serves as both historical record and worship expression, preserving for future generations the details of how the Lord delivered Israel from their oppressors. The Song of Deborah begins with a call to praise the Lord for his mighty deeds, acknowledging that the victory belonged not to human warriors, but to the God of Israel. It vividly describes the cosmic scope of the battle, portraying the very stars in their courses as fighting against Sisera. This poetic imagery emphasizes the supernatural character of the victory and God's absolute sovereignty over creation itself. The song also provides important historical details about the condition of Israel before the victory, describing how travel had become dangerous and how village life had ceased under Canaanite oppression. It paints a picture of a nation that had nearly lost hope until God raised up Deborah as a mother in Israel, bringing justice and deliverance to her people. Particularly significant is the song's celebration of various tribes that participated in the battle, while also noting those who failed to join the fight for freedom. This serves as both historical record and moral commentary, highlighting the importance of unity and courage in times of national crisis. The tribes of Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Naphtali, and Issachar are praised for their willingness to risk everything for liberty. The song reaches its climactic moment in its detailed description of Sisera's final moments and Jael's decisive action. The poetic account emphasizes the complete reversal of fortune that occurred, with the mighty warrior reduced to helplessness and death at the hands of a nomadic woman. This portion of the song particularly highlights the theme of God's ability to humble the proud and exalt the humble. The Song of Deborah concludes with a powerful contrast between the fate of God's enemies and the future of those who love him. It envisions the complete destruction of all who oppose the Lord's purposes, while promising that those who serve him faithfully will shine like the sun in its full strength. This conclusion transforms the historical account into a prophetic vision of ultimate divine justice and triumph. The period of peace that followed Deborah's victory lasted for 40 years, representing an entire generation of Israelites who grew up free from foreign oppression. This extended period of rest allowed Hebrew communities to rebuild their economic infrastructure, restore their religious practices, and strengthen their tribal relationships. The roads that had been controlled by Canaanite forces were reopened, enabling trade and communication to flourish once again. Agriculture, which had suffered tremendously under the tribute system imposed by Jabin and Sisera, experienced a remarkable revival during these 4 decades of peace. Hebrew farmers were able to keep their full harvests, leading to increased prosperity and population growth. The young men who had been conscripted for forced labor projects were free to pursue their own occupations and start families, contributing to a general sense of optimism and renewal throughout the land. Religious life also flourished under Deborah's continuing leadership as judge. The oppression that had made proper worship difficult was lifted, and Hebrew communities were able to restore their festivals, sacrifices, and religious education. This spiritual renewal was crucial for maintaining the national identity and covenant relationship that distinguished Israel from the surrounding pagan nations. Deborah's story provides profound insights into the nature of divine calling and leadership. Her rise to prominence was not the result of political ambition or military conquest, but rather her faithful response to God's call on her life. She demonstrates that effective leadership in God's kingdom is not limited by gender, social status, or conventional expectations, but is determined by spiritual sensitivity and obedience to divine purposes. Her willingness to accompany Barak into battle, despite having no military background herself, illustrates the courage required of those called to spiritual leadership. She understood that her role was not to provide tactical expertise, but to serve as a living reminder of God's presence and promises. Her very presence on the battlefield communicated to the Hebrew forces that this was indeed the Lord's battle and that victory was assured. The complementary relationship between Deborah and Barak also provides a model for how spiritual and military leadership can work together effectively. Rather than competing for authority or glory, they each fulfilled their distinct roles in service of the greater good. Barak's willingness to accept guidance from a prophetess demonstrates the humility that characterized the greatest leaders in biblical history. Deborah's legacy extends far beyond the immediate military victory over Sisera's forces. She established a pattern of godly leadership that emphasized justice, wisdom, and accessibility to all people regardless of their social status. Her court under the palm tree became a symbol of righteous judgment that inspired future generations of Hebrew leaders. The fact that she is remembered as both judge and prophetess indicates the integration of civil and spiritual authority that characterized the best periods in Israel's history. Rather than seeing these roles as separate or conflicting, Deborah demonstrated how earthly governance could be conducted according to heavenly principles. Her decisions were grounded not in political expediency or personal preference, but in divine revelation and biblical law. Her story also emphasizes the crucial role that women played in the purposes of God throughout biblical history. From Eve to Mary, the scriptures consistently show how the Lord used women to accomplish his most significant works of redemption and deliverance. Deborah's prominence as both judge and prophetess challenges any notion that spiritual leadership is exclusively masculine in nature. The theological significance of Deborah's victory extends beyond the immediate liberation of Israel from Canaanite oppression. It serves as a powerful demonstration of God's faithfulness to his covenant promises and his ability to deliver his people even from seemingly impossible circumstances. The complete reversal of military fortunes at the Kishon River could only be explained as direct divine intervention. This miraculous victory also foreshadowed the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom over all earthly powers that oppose his purposes. Just as Sisera's iron chariots were rendered useless by divine intervention, so all human technologies and weapons will ultimately prove powerless against the sovereign will of the Almighty. The song's vision of God's enemies perishing while his people shine like the sun points toward the final consummation of his redemptive plan. The story of Deborah continues to inspire believers today who face seemingly insurmountable challenges in their own lives and communities. Her example demonstrates that God can use ordinary people in extraordinary ways when they remain faithful to his calling and obedient to his word. The palm tree where she held court represents the availability of divine wisdom to all who seek it with sincere hearts. Her willingness to step into roles that required tremendous courage and faith provides encouragement to modern believers who may feel inadequate for the tasks God places before them. The victory at the Kishon River reminds us that divine strength is made perfect in human weakness, and that God's methods often confound conventional wisdom and expectations. In conclusion, the story of Deborah stands as one of the most remarkable accounts of leadership, faith, and divine deliverance in all of Scripture. Through her obedience to God's calling, an entire nation was liberated from oppression and restored to the blessings of covenant relationship with the Almighty. Her legacy challenges us to recognize that true greatness is measured not by worldly standards of power and position, but by faithful service to God's purposes and compassionate care for his people. The palm tree of Deborah, where justice flowed like a river and wisdom was freely dispensed to all who sought it, remains a powerful symbol of what leadership can accomplish when it is rooted in divine calling rather than human ambition. Her song of victory continues to echo through the centuries, reminding us that our God reigns supreme over all earthly powers and that his love for his people endures forever.